I took a job reviewing deleted 911 calls, and one of them was not supposed to exist. It told me that I would be reviewing flagged audio calls, basically listening to recordings that had been removed from public record, just kind of marking if they had been corrupted, incomplete, or if they needed to be archived. It sounded boring, but pretty easy money. On the third night that I was on the job, I noticed everything was normal. All of them were labeled with like the case numbers, the dates, names, that kind of a thing. There was one file that specifically stood out, and it was labeled "Do Not Process." Obviously, curiosity got the best of me, and I started to listen to it. And at first it was silence, and then a woman's voice came on. It was very calm and controlled. She said, "I'd like to report something, but I don't know that you can help me." The operator sounded pretty confused and asked her what she was talking about, and the woman hesitated, and then she went on to say something that made me pause the recording for a minute. She gave an address. I recognized it immediately. It was about 15 minutes from where I am, and she got really quiet and she said, "There are people here that aren't supposed to be here." The operator asked if she meant like intruders, and she said, "No, these are people who have been recorded missing already." There was a long pause, and then there was another voice. It was in the background of the recording, and it was a man, and he whispered something, and then the woman went silent for a minute, and then the line cuts. I sat there trying to process what I just listened to, and then I went back to go look at the details again, look at like the case number. There was still not one. I couldn't find any other details other than an address. And then I did something that I probably shouldn't have done, and I searched the address. What I found didn't quite make sense. It was a location that hadn't been used for about 8 years. It had been abandoned. Before that, it was tied to a lot of missing person files, all unresolved. I went back to the recording, and it was gone. It was like completely removed from the system, like I didn't just listen to it. So the next day I went and asked my supervisor about it, and he just kind of looked at me and he said, "If you ever see a file like that, especially one that says 'do not process,' you do not open them, you don't click them." I asked what he meant by files like that, and he just looked at me and he said, "Ones that are not supposed to be heard." The next day I came into work, and my access was revoked, and my contract was terminated early. But this is the part that bothers me the most. I was doing a little bit of research on my phone, scrolling, and I found some articles, and they had the same address, and it was recent, and it had been neighbors calling to say that they heard noise complaints coming from that address. They said that they heard multiple voices in that building when that building is supposed to be vacant. I worked night shift as a nurse on the 4th floor. The 4th floor was like long-term patients, usually elderly people, end-of-life comfort kind of a thing, mostly quiet, right? So there was one night I was doing charting, and a call button went off for the patient that was in room 412. So the patient that was in room 412 was nonverbal, late-stage dementia, couldn't walk, and could barely lift up her hands. So anyways, I grab my clipboard and I start walking down the hall. I go into 412's room, and she was sitting up. That alone was very wrong. She hasn't sat up unassisted in weeks, and her eyes were wide open, staring at the corner of the ceiling. So I just kind of said her name really softly, asked if she needed something, and she took her hand and she pointed up to the ceiling. Again, very wrong. She could barely lift up her hands. Anyway, so I looked up where she was looking, and there was nothing there. So I just kind of went over, I checked her vitals. I said, "Are you in pain?" And she just kind of kept staring up in the corner. And then she softly whispered, "He's not a doctor." "Who isn't a doctor?" And she carefully took her finger and he pointed it to the doorway behind me that I walked through. And my stomach just kind of dropped a little bit. I started to feel a little icky, and I felt a cold breeze go up my neck. I turned around. Nobody was there. The hallway was empty. So I go back and look at her, and she's laying flat. Eyes are closed. Monitor is monitoring. It was as if she never moved, like that whole thing didn't just happen. So I just kind of marked down what happened in some notes, and then I just tried to brush it off. So that had happened somewhere between 2:30 to 2:40 a.m. And then at 3:07 a.m., security called the nurse's station, and they said, "Why is there somebody in a white coat walking on that floor?" I told them that no physicians were on that unit overnight, and they said that the man didn't have a badge on him. So they were just saying when they tried to approach him, He turned a corner past room 412 and disappeared, which is very odd because there are no exits down that hallway. Room 412's patient actually passed away the next afternoon, and from there on out, around 2:30 a.m. to 2:40 a.m., the cameras always would glitch on that floor. I used to drive rideshare on the night shift. Mostly airport runs, bar pickups, just people trying to get home safely. Then one night around 2:30 a.m., I got a request to go pick somebody up from a hospital, and the pickup pin where it had on the screen was right outside of the emergency section of the hospital. When I pulled in, nobody was there. That wasn't unusual. I mean, it did usually take people a couple of minutes to come down and get into the car. And then I refreshed my page and it said that the person was approaching. I still didn't see anybody, so I was waiting there. And then I heard my back door open. I literally heard it. And my car dipped down like somebody's body weight just got into the back. So I turned around expecting to see somebody, and nobody was there. I figured maybe the door just didn't latch right, so I reached back there and I closed the door properly. And then the app updated again, and it said the trip has begun. Destination 15 minutes. I sat there thinking that the app was just having some kind of a glitch. Then I heard breathing, very, very quiet, right behind my seat. So I checked the rearview mirror. There was still nobody there. The seat was empty, but the window was starting to fog up slightly, like somebody was breathing on it. A small circle formed of condensation onto the window. 1, 2. I started driving. I did not look back again. I just was going to do this trip. I literally drove the entire ride in silence. No music, not a word, nothing. And once I got to the destination, it said that the passenger had exited. I heard the back door open again, then close. Trip complete, 5 stars. No name, no receipt from who this came from. The only thing they did was leave a review, and it said, "Thank you for getting me home safely." I checked the pickup location later, and the hospital did confirm that somebody passed away in the ER that night at 2:28 a.m., 2 minutes before I got the request for the ride. Let's just say I didn't drive nights after that. So I took a temporary construction job through a private contractor. Location wasn't listed on the paperwork. It was just coordinates and an NDA. When I arrived, it looked like an empty desert. There was security guards, there was security gates, and there was a road that kind of led underground. They told us that we were going to be building a continuity facility. Climate controlled, self-sustainable, long-term occupancy capable. It didn't feel like a storm shelter, it felt like something more permanent, and the further down we went, the weirder it kind of got. There were farms already installed, there was medical rooms fully stocked, they even had apartments that were listed with numbers, not names. One of my supervisors joked, "If the world blinks, this place won't." Nobody laughed, and then around my 3rd week of working there, they wanted me to go work on a part of the place that was called the selection wing. So that's when I kind of noticed something was a little different. So on the apartments, they had like a little plaque to the side of them. Didn't have the names, didn't have the numbers. It had like net worth almost. It had 500 million, 1 billion, 10 billion. I kept going and I found a separate hallway. This place had no windows. It just had little bunks in the apartments. It wasn't as bougie as the other ones. There weren't any farms nearby. Each of those apartment doors were labeled essential personnel. I asked my supervisor how many people this whole facility could handle. He said not many. That night in the break area, I heard 2 engineers talking. They were talking about how they already had the simulations up and running, and they said that the social unrest happened around day 9. The other one replied, "That's why the outside locks engage on day 7. The outside locks. Specifically on the essential personnel wing." I finished up my contract and never went back to this area. 6 months later, I got an automated email. It had no sender, but it did say on the subject line, "Phase 1 complete." Sometimes I wonder if the bunkers are used for protection, or if they're just sitting there waiting for a reason to be used. I used to do overnight inventory for a chain of storage facilities. And not like the front office stuff, more of like the back units. The ones that are locked, the ones where people use them to basically forget things exist. They have no cameras inside, nothing like that. Most nights were pretty boring, just clipboard, flashlight, marking units, that kind of a thing. There was one specific facility that they sent me to just one time a month, and it was just past town. There was no street lights, no other buildings, literally just stacks of metal doors. So before my shift started, my manager pulled me in and he said, "Don't look inside any of the units that have a red sticker on them, just mark them as verified." I just kind of assumed it was legal stuff, delinquent holds, evidence holders, that kind of a thing. Around 1:30 a.m. I came across my first red sticker, storage unit, and I just kind of marked it off of my list, and it was unit 317, and I started to walk away, and that's when I heard it. It was a thud on the inside. I just kind of froze and I waited, and then I heard something else. It was like something hit the wall, like something's weight shifted against the metal. I told myself maybe it was an animal or just something falling over, and then that's when I heard a voice, and it was very soft, and it just said hello. I dropped my flashlight, and I just stood there trying to convince myself that what I heard wasn't real. And then I heard another soft whisper saying, "Is anybody there?" And it sounded a little desperate. I ran back to the office and I told my manager, and he didn't seem very surprised, and he just said, "Did you open the unit?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Okay, just mark it as verified on your list and continue on." I should have left right then, but I needed this job so bad. So I kept going, and every single red sticker unit that I passed that night made a noise. Scratching, whispering, soft crying. By the time I had finished, it was about 4 a.m., and I went back to the office, shaking a little bit because all your mind can do is question what's inside of those units. And I noticed that there was a new sheet of paper, and it was marked from all of the red sticker units, and there was a name on each of them. Next to each red sticker unit was a person's name. I recognized one name on there specifically, Unit 317. It was my name, and it was set for next month. Next month's inventory. I immediately quit. About a week later, I drove past the facility again just to convince myself that everything was normal. People were moving things back and forth. Everything seemed okay. I went inside and I asked a lady about Unit 317, and she said, "We don't have a Unit 317. And I said, "Yes, you do, because I saw it when I was working here. I've been inside of it." I had literally heard somebody inside of this unit. And so she just turned the map of the units towards me, and it did skip. It went from 316 to 318. There was no 317 on her unit map. 2 nights ago, I got a call from a blocked number. I almost didn't answer it, but I did. It was a long silence, and then it was a voice, soft, very weak, and it just said, "Hello." It was me. I interned at a national news network sometime around an election season. Not a recent one, but in the past. My job was pretty boring. I was just logging footage, organizing clips, that kind of a thing. One afternoon, I was told to pull past protest footage that happened about 3 years earlier, which is strange because we were covering a brand new demonstration that we were doing that day. When I brought it to my supervisor, she said, "Good, we'll blend it with the live footage that we're going to get today." I thought she meant B-roll, but she didn't. So I sat there in the editing room and watched them blend together the protest that was happening now and the past one, and blending the footage together. Different city, different year, but similar signs. They completely darkened the footage. They added a smoke overlay layer. They adjusted the audio levels, and then suddenly this whole protest looked way more violent than it actually was. The producer leaned over and he said, "If it looks like it's escalating, then it actually will." That same night, every major outlet had said that the protest was becoming aggressive, and it wasn't yet, but then by the time the morning came, it was. People would show up to these protests expecting absolute chaos, and they sure delivered. I started to notice a couple other little things. Pre-written headlines saved days before the actual event. Stock phrases in shared folders labeled crisis template. One day I had opened a draft on accident that I wasn't supposed to see, and it was labeled public reaction to energy grid failure. And it was dated 2 months prior, before it actually happened. And when I brought this up, within the hour, my login credentials were revoked. About a week later, I got an email and it said, "You don't report the news, you direct it." I obviously deleted it, but I still think about the control room here and there, and I think about how easy it is to move an entire nation just by using a video slider. So I used to clean houses that people wouldn't stay in anymore, and it wasn't like hoarder houses, it was worse. It was the kind of houses that were just left as is, like somebody left and never came back. So a small company would get contracts for abandoned properties, and we would go in, we would deep clean, stage the homes, and sell them like nothing ever happened. Most of the time, it was obvious why people would leave the house. Bad energy, mold, lots of damage. But there was one house we came across, and it was completely normal, like too normal. Everything was still there. Clothes were folded. There was a glass of water on the nightstand. Dishes were put away. It was like somebody paused midday and then never unpaused. So it was just my job to go in, clean it, and report if anything was off or unusual. And at first, nothing was until I made it to the hallway. There were photos that were lining the wall, and it was all of the same person. Different outfits, different places, but she was doing the same thing in all of them. She was staring directly at the camera, not smiling, just staring. I didn't think very much of it until I went to go and clean the bathroom, and I was wiping down the foggy streaks off the mirror, and I found that there was some writing underneath it. Not on top, but underneath, like it had been written a long time ago. And it said in all caps, "Don't let her see you see her." I stepped back really fast, and I kind of just admired what I just looked at. I tried to just tell myself it was a prank, something funny, haha, something written a long time ago. I kept working, and then later on I went back into the hallway, and I noticed something. The pictures in the hallway were totally different. Same woman, same outfits, same places, all of that was the same except for one thing. She was not staring directly into the camera anymore. She was looking off to the side, like she was staring at something else, and I felt sick. I slowly turned to look at whatever her eyes were aiming at, and I looked back at her again, and then her eyes again were back at the camera, staring straight at me, and this time the pictures were different. They were closer, like it looked like it was zoomed in a little bit more. So I grabbed all of my things and I ran to the front door to leave. The handle was moving, but it was not opening. And then I heard something behind me, a little footstep in the carpet. And then I heard a little quiet whisper. I didn't turn around. I just sat there trying to breathe. And the whisper said, "Don't look unless you want to stay." Somehow I got the door open. Next thing you know, I'm outside. I ran, and about a week later I got my final paycheck. But with that envelope of money, I also got a printed picture that I saw, and it was a picture of me, and the picture was me not looking at the camera, but I was sitting there at the front door looking back at her, or whoever the voice was. So I worked the night shift as a janitor for an international airport. So my shift was graveyard. It was 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. And there was one night where my supervisor, he handed me a new badge and he said, "Tonight you're going to go clean a restricted area." The badge was just a temporary access badge, and when he handed it to me, he told me not to ask any questions. Airports are basically like underground cities, so I didn't question him and I went, and when I scanned the badge, it opened up to a hallway. It didn't look much like a maintenance hallway though. There was no pipes, no wiring, no storage. It was just kind of nice concrete walls, new lights, that kind of a deal. I noticed that the hallway sloped downwards. It went farther than any baggage tunnel should. And as I kept walking down it, I came across a door, and it was authorized ground transportation, authorized personnel only. There were no vehicle sounds, carts, anything like that. It was just kind of silence. And then I heard a couple of voices talking, and so I put my ear closer to the door. This is the conversation that was being had. So one person said, "They'll load through the main gate," and then the other person said, "Public manifest," question mark. And then the other person said, "Different plane," and my stomach dropped. So I looked around and I saw some security cameras. They weren't typical airport cameras. They weren't mounted. They weren't logoed by the airport. And then down the hall, I heard a door unlock. I hadn't touched anything. The door just kind of opened up on its own and nobody came out. So as the door was opening, I kind of went over just to take a peek. I mean, I did have an access badge. I was supposed to be there, right? And I noticed that there was rows of chairs. It looked like a whole boarding area. There was like a digital screen, but instead of like flight numbers, it just had one word on the screen and it said departed. There was no airline name, no destination, just the word departed. I packed my way out of the entire thing. I felt like I should not be there, so I left, and then I kind of kept popping up in my brain. So then the next week I asked my supervisor about it, and I didn't like his response very much. He just kind of looked confused, and he said, "We don't have access underneath that terminal." And then the next week I noticed that my badge had stopped working. In that same hallway, I was never able to find it again, or the entrance to it where I did once click my badge. I was a patrol officer for 8 years, and I've seen a lot of things that you don't talk about, and this is one of them. So we got a call at 1:40 a.m. It was a 911 hang-up, and it was in like a suburban neighborhood, basically. Standard welfare check. The dispatch said that they called him back, and the other people answered, but they weren't talking. It was just kind of breathing through the line. So my partner and I get there, we knock on the door, and nobody answers, but the door's unlocked. That's never a good sign. So we announced ourselves and we stepped inside. The house was clean, the TV was off, everything was pretty spotless. There was no sign of any kind of a struggle, but there was a cell phone on the dining table, and it still had an ongoing call to 911, but the screen was cracked. So I picked up the phone off the dining table and I listened for a sec. The line was still open, just mostly static breathing, kind of like what the dispatch told us. And anyway, so my partner, he went upstairs to go and check the hallway, and it was cleared. Checked the basement, cleared. There was something a little odd that I noticed. In the hallway, they had family photos hanging up, and in every single one of them, it was like a person was missing. And it looked like it would have been the dad that was missing because it was like the wife, kid, da-da-da-da-da. And it wasn't just like nobody was there. It was physically cut out with some scissors. I heard my partner call me from bedroom, and he said, "I've got something." And so I go in there, and the bed was stripped. The mattress was gone. So it was just the box spring sitting there. And the weird thing was there was a dark stain in the middle of it. It was fresh, but there was no body, no drag marks, no sign of a struggle other than a dark stain. And so we called it in, crime scene came out, we were outside just kind of waiting, and then dispatch called to me in again, like on the radio. So they told me the 911 call was still open, and I said, "That's impossible, I'm holding the phone right here." They went quiet for a second, and then they said, "No, officer, not that one. A different phone call, but from the same address, is happening." The recording they played back for us later on is what still bothers me. You can clearly hear me coming into the house announcing myself. You can hear my partner going upstairs, and underneath it all, a second set of footsteps moving through the house, keeping pace with us.